press briefing room was packed, the air thick with an unspoken tension that hummed beneath the surface. A row of cameras lined the back wall, their lenses locked onto the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, poised and unwavering. She had stood at this podium countless times before, fielding tough questions, deflecting traps and controlling the narrative. But today, something felt different, something sharper, something waiting to ignite. She adjusted the microphone, exhaling smoothly as she scanned the room. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started." Immediately, hands shot up across the room, journalists eager for their moment, voices vying to control the conversation. Karoline pointed to Tom Branson, a senior correspondent from a major network, who adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Ms. Leavitt, can you clarify the administration's stance on the proposed tax cuts?" She nodded, delivering a concise, well-rehearsed response, striking the balance between informative and politically sharp. He followed up on education reform, and she handled it just as smoothly, controlled, precise, giving them just enough to write their stories without giving anything away. Then, a sharp voice sliced through the air, turning heads with its force. "Miss Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." Karoline's eyes landed on Rachel Monroe, a journalist from a highly opinionated outlet, known for her aggressive questioning in viral moments. She sat in the front row, leaning forward, her pen tapping against her notepad, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "Go ahead," Karoline said, her tone steady, measured, but already anticipating trouble. Rachel didn't hesitate for a second. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities? Because the data suggests." Karoline lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I've answered that question before. The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss today's topic, I'm happy to continue." A murmur rippled through the room, journalists exchanging glances as they sensed the shift in energy. But Rachel wasn't done, not even close. She leaned in further, voice sharp and unwavering. "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address?" "I did answer," Karoline interrupted, her voice firm, but even. She let her gaze sweep the room, a silent warning that she was ready to move on. A brief pause, a beat of silence, just long enough to make it seem like things might settle. Then, Rachel's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "I just don't see why you're avoiding it. It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The temperature in the room shifted, the energy suddenly heavier, charged with a confrontation that was escalating fast. Some reporters exchanged glances, intrigued by the tension unfolding in front of them. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware of how quickly a press conference could spiral. No one liked a briefing turning into a showdown, but that was exactly what was happening. Karoline exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer." Rachel's smirk widened, sensing her moment. "So that's a no comment." The weight of the moment settled into the room. The silence no longer empty, but waiting, like an elastic band stretched to its breaking point. Karoline adjusted her stance, placing both hands on the podium as her patience thinned. "I've answered your question. I'll be moving on now." She turned toward another journalist, signaling a return to order. But before the next question could even be spoken, Rachel struck again. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face, not much, just a brief tightening around her eyes, but enough for those watching to catch. She knew how this worked, she had seen it before. There was a difference between pressing for accountability and turning a moment into a performance. And right now, Rachel was choosing the latter. A few cameras panned from Karoline to Rachel, capturing every subtle movement, every tension-filled second that could later be spun into a viral clip. Karoline inhaled through her nose, exhaling with deliberate control. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I will answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." Rachel tilted her head slightly, a new tactic already forming. "Sure, new question." She paused for effect before delivering her next line. "Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A few quiet gasps slipped through the room, pens scratching against notepads, cameras zooming in closer. Karoline blinked once, measured, the only sign that the remark had landed. She let go of the podium briefly, her grip tightening just for a second before releasing. Then, she smiled, but not the warm, diplomatic kind. This was a different kind of smile, the kind that said, "I see exactly what you're doing." She took her time before responding. "Transparency," she repeated, letting the word settle. That's exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency, it's about theatrics. The words hung in the air, the power in the room suddenly shifting. For the first time, Rachel's smirk faltered. Another journalist, Mark Reynolds, a seasoned reporter who had covered politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." Rachel didn't blink. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more likely it was to go viral. Every second she dragged this out was fuel for a social media firestorm. Karoline saw it too. And now she had a choice. Engage and let Rachel push the moment until it spiraled, or shut it down entirely before it turned into something beyond her control. She sighed, finally shifting her gaze towards security at the side of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The movement alone was enough. The entire room tensed as everyone realized what was about to happen. Rachel saw it too. She had a choice now. She could stand her ground, force them to remove her, and turn this into a spectacle. Or she could leave on her own, still spinning the story in her favor, but without the scene. The calculation played out on Rachel's face, her mind working fast behind her eyes. Then, after a tense pause that seemed to stretch forever, she made her move. She reached for her notepad, adjusted the strap of her bag, and stood. Then, just loud enough for the cameras to catch it, she muttered, "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. The moment was set. The footage would spread. The headlines were already writing themselves. Karoline didn't react. She stayed still, watching, waiting. Rachel turned, walking toward the exit, the cameras tracking her every step. The door closed behind her. And just like that, it was over. Or at least it should have been. But the real battle was just beginning. Within minutes, the clip would spread like wildfire. And by the time Karoline stepped off the podium, her name would already be trending. The second Karoline stepped off the podium, her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket. She didn't need to look, she already knew what was happening. The clip was spreading. The moment Rachel Monroe walked out of the press room was already fueling an online firestorm. Karoline walked swiftly down the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floors, but the sound was drowned out by the conversations happening around her. Eyes huddled together near her office, their expressions tight, their eyes glued to their screens. "It's already trending?" one of them muttered, scrolling furiously through Twitter. Karoline pulled out her phone and saw it herself. Silencing the press was climbing the charts. Major outlets were running with it, twisting the moment into something it wasn't. Headlines flashed across her screen: Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions, attack on journalism or justified response, and the most dramatic of all, democracy dies in the press room. She exhaled sharply, pushing open the door to her office where her senior aide Daniel Hart was already waiting. "This is going to get ugly," he said, his voice low and serious. Karoline tossed her phone onto her desk and crossed her arms. "It was always going to get ugly," she replied. "They wanted this, and now they have it." Daniel nodded. Monroe's already doing interviews. She just went live on InSpec. He turned his laptop screen toward her, and there Rachel was, sitting in a dimly lit studio, eyes wide with manufactured indignation. "I was simply doing my job," Rachel told the anchor, her voice carefully measured. "I asked a tough but necessary question, and instead of addressing it, I was removed. That should alarm every American who values a free press." Karoline scoffed under her breath. It was so predictable. The way Rachel positioned herself as the brave journalist silenced by the administration, the martyr for press freedom. It wasn't about truth, it was about control. She had played the moment perfectly, and now the media was running with it. Daniel glanced up. "So what's the move? Do we respond? Go on the offensive?" Karoline paced the room, thinking. "No," she finally said, "not yet. If we jump in now, we're playing their game." Daniel hesitated. "And if we don't?" She turned to him, her expression sharp. "Then we let them overplay their hand." The noise outside was growing. Reporters were already gathering, cameras pointed at the entrance, waiting for her next move. Karoline walked to the window, looking down at the crowd forming on the sidewalk. Every network had stationed their correspondents outside, eager for a statement, a reaction, anything to keep the cycle spinning. Daniel's phone buzzed. "The White House just put out a statement," he said, scanning the message quickly. "They're distancing themselves, but they're not condemning you." Karoline smirked. For now, she knew how this worked. The second public pressure became too much, they'd throw her under the bus. It wasn't personal, it was politics. Daniel's phone buzzed again. His brows furrowed as he read. Fox News just aired the full clip. Karoline arched a brow. And they're backing you, saying Monroe was grandstanding. They called it a stunt for social media. Karoline let out a short breath. Good. That meant the narrative wasn't fully lost. But she also knew that winning one side wasn't enough. The real danger wasn't the political spin, it was the perception battle. She turned back to Daniel. What's the public sentiment? Daniel pulled up a live feed of social media reactions, scrolling through thousands of comments. It's split, he admitted. Your supporters are saying you stood your ground, didn't take the bait. The other side, well, they're calling you an authoritarian. Karoline rolled her eyes. Of course they are. Daniel sighed. If we don't act soon, that label will stick. She tapped her fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Then she nodded. Release the full, unedited footage. No commentary, no spin. Just let the facts speak for themselves. Daniel hesitated. Will that be enough? Karoline's eyes hardened. It has to be. The video is live within the hour. No dramatic edits. No captions twisting the story. Just a raw exchange between Karoline and Rachel Monroe. The title was simple. Watch for yourself. The full exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Rachel Monroe. It took less than 20 minutes for the narrative to shift. Some viewers, expecting to see an oppressive crackdown on the press, instead saw something else: a journalist who repeatedly disrupted the conference, ignored other reporters, and forced the moment into an unnecessary spectacle. The comments began to shift. Wait, she actually answered the question. Monroe just didn't like the answer. This wasn't about journalism. This was about going viral. I don't even like this administration, but Monroe was clearly pushing for a scene. As the video spread, so did the divide. Some outlets doubled down, refusing to acknowledge the full footage, while others began softening their coverage, subtly walking back their initial outrage-fueled headlines. Meanwhile, Monroe wasn't slowing down. She ramped up her media tour, appearing on every network willing to give her airtime. She painted herself as the victim of a silencing machine, claiming she had merely asked a question and was removed for it. But now she had a problem. The full video existed, and people were watching it. Karoline sat in her office, watching the media landscape shift in real time. She wasn't naive, she knew this wouldn't just go away. But she also knew something important had happened. For once, the public wasn't just consuming the narrative, they were questioning it. And in a world where outrage ruled, that was a dangerous thing for the people who thrived on manipulating the truth. Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts. Monroe just responded to the full video release. Karoline raised a brow. Let me guess, damage control? Daniel smirked. She's saying the video was edited. Karoline laughed, shaking her head. Of course she is. Daniel turned his phone toward her. Monroe's latest tweet flashed across the screen. The full footage doesn't change the facts. I was silenced for asking a question. This isn't about one clip, it's about a pattern of suppressing the press. Karoline exhaled sharply. She knew what came next. This wasn't just a news cycle anymore. This was a war over reality itself. And the battle was far from over. Karoline sat at her desk, fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood, watching the firestorm unfold. The full video release had landed like a bomb, throwing a wrench into Monroe's carefully crafted narrative. But rather than backing down, Monroe doubled down, claiming the footage was edited for political convenience. The irony wasn't lost on Karoline, a journalist accusing a press secretary of manipulating the truth while doing exactly that herself. Daniel scrolled through his phone, shaking his head. She's pushing the silencing the press angle harder than ever. Every network is running it. He turned the screen toward her, showing a live broadcast where Monroe was mid-sentence. This isn't just about me, she declared, eyes glistening with manufactured conviction. I was simply doing my job, Monroe told the anchor, her voice carefully measured. I asked a tough but necessary question, and instead of addressing it, I was removed. That should alarm every American who values a free press. Karoline smirked, leaning back in her chair. Impressive, she muttered. She's managed to turn a disruption into a crusade. Daniel nodded. And she's getting traction. Stand with Monroe is trending now. Outside the building, protesters had gathered, carrying signs with phrases like "Free the press and silence is censorship." A few cameras were set up on the sidewalk, ready to broadcast live reactions. Monroe had manufactured a movement overnight, and now the pressure was mounting. Karoline exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. She had been in politics long enough to know how these things spiraled. But what did frustrate her was how the truth no longer seemed to matter. The full footage was there, undeniable, and yet people were choosing to believe the lie. Daniel's phone buzzed again, and he let out a low whistle. "You're not gonna like this," he muttered. Karoline lifted an eyebrow. "The White House." He nodded, scrolling through a leaked internal memo. "They're considering distancing themselves from you publicly," he said. "They might throw you under the bus." Karoline wasn't surprised. She had seen this play before when an administration felt the heat. They didn't put out the fire. They sacrificed whoever was closest to the flames. She nodded once. "And what's the president's stance?" Daniel hesitated. "He's staying out of it for now. If the pressure gets worse, that might change." Karoline exhaled, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. "So they'll let me take the hits while they test public sentiment. If it gets bad enough, I'm the scapegoat." Daniel didn't say anything, but the answer was clear. She stood, walking over to the window, watching as reporters and protesters swarmed outside. They weren't just covering the story anymore, they were feeding it. Monroe had turned a moment into a movement, and now Karoline had to decide how to counter it. Daniel watched her carefully. "So what's our next move?" Karoline turned back, her expression unreadable. "We hit her where it hurts." Within hours, Karoline's team released a second clip, a compilation of Monroe's past disruptions in press briefings, showing a pattern of behavior. The footage painted a very different story, one where Monroe wasn't a silenced journalist, but a grandstanding performer. The internet erupted. "This woman isn't a journalist. She's a professional agitator. Monroe has done this before. She forces these moments to make herself the story. She's not being silenced. She's manipulating the press for clicks." Cable news networks were forced to cover it, some grudgingly admitting that Monroe had a history of disrupting press conferences. Even a few neutral reporters began questioning her motives, subtly distancing themselves from the hysteria. Monroe lashed out, accusing Karoline's team of a coordinated smear campaign. But the damage was already done. She had lost control of the narrative. That night, Monroe went live on InSpec for an emergency interview. She looked rattled, her polished confidence cracking under the pressure. "This administration will do anything to discredit me," she said, her voice tight. "This is a distraction from the real issue, press freedom." But the anchor wasn't playing along anymore. "Rachel," he said carefully, "your past disruptions, do you think that played a role in how this was perceived?" Monroe froze for just a second, just enough for the audience to catch the hesitation. I was just doing my job," she finally stammered. The damage was done. Viewers noticed. Monroe had lost the unwavering support of the media machine. The public started to turn, realizing they had been sold a lie. And by the next morning, Stand With Monroe was dead. Back in her office, Karoline watched it unfold without celebration. She had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Daniel walked in, looking relieved. "It's dying down. Monroe's moment is over." He smirked. "She's backpedaling, saying this was never about her." Karoline nodded, but her eyes remained sharp. "And the White House?" Daniel checked his messages. "They're shifting their stance. Now they're saying you handled a difficult moment with professionalism." Karoline let out a short laugh. "Predictable." Daniel hesitated before asking, "So what now?" Karoline looked out the window at the reporters still lingering outside. "We don't just let this moment die," she said. "We turn it into something bigger." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Karoline smiled. "We expose how the media really works." Karoline stood at the podium, staring at the sea of journalists before her. The usual faces were there, some eager, some cautious, some waiting for their next opportunity to twist her words. She knew the battle with Monroe was over, but the war on truth had only just begun. This wasn't about one press conference, one journalist, or one viral moment. It was about a media machine designed to manipulate narrative, not report them. Daniel watched from the sidelines, arms crossed as the briefing room hummed with tension. They had called this press conference at the last minute, offering no details, just a simple statement. "Full transparency starts now." The speculation had been immediate and wild. Some believed Karoline would resign, others thought she was going to apologize, but none of them were prepared for what was coming. The cameras rolled as she adjusted the microphone, her expression unreadable. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "Before we begin today's briefing, I'd like to address something bigger than any single moment, any single exchange." The room stilled, reporters leaned forward, sensing something different. She continued, locking eyes with the front row. "Over the last few days, we've watched a simple event, a routine press briefing, become something far bigger than it ever should have been. We've seen facts twisted, narrative spun, and truth discarded in favor of outrage. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably, realizing where this was going. Karoline let a pause hang in the air before continuing. So today, instead of reacting to a false narrative, I'd like to show you something real. She gestured to the side, and a large screen flickered to life behind her. The first clip began to play the unedited version of the Michonge. Start to finish, no cuts, no manipulation. The room was silent as the footage played. Every interruption, every time Monroe tried to hijack the conversation, every warning Karoline had given it was all there. The reporters couldn't deny what they were seeing. The spin that had dominated headlines for days was collapsing in real time. When the clip ended, Karoline turned back to the crowd. That's what happened, she said simply. No edits, no commentary, just the truth. The room remained eerily quiet, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling on their shoulders. She wasn't done. Now, let's talk about what happened after that, she continued. Another clip began to play a montage of news anchors, social media influencers, and columnists repeating the exact same phrases about Monroe's removal. Some had identical wording, proving the coordination behind the outrage. The screen showed tweets, op-eds, and headlines side by side exposing how the machine worked in real time. Daniel watched as some journalists looked down ashamed, while others sat frozen, unable to defend what was now undeniable. The message was clear: this wasn't journalism, it was theater. Karoline let the silence linger before speaking again. So my question to you all is simple, she said, her voice razor sharp. Who benefits from this? She let her gaze sweep across the room, challenging them to answer. A few reporters swallowed hard. Some knew they had pushed a false narrative, but admitting that, impossible. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. A journalist from the back finally spoke up. Are you saying the press isn't free? His voice wavered slightly, caught between defensiveness and genuine curiosity. Karoline exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. I'm saying the press isn't honest, she corrected. There's a difference. The press conference wasn't just a moment, it was a reckoning. Within hours, the clips of Karoline exposing the media machine spread like wildfire. Some outlets scrambled to cover their tracks, while others doubled down, trying to shift the focus back onto Karoline herself. Karoline Leavitt's attack on the media was a dangerous display of authoritarian rhetoric, one op-ed read. Leavitt's press briefing was an orchestrated stunt. Another claimed. But the problem for them was simple: people had seen the truth with their own eyes. The American public wasn't stupid. They knew when they were being played, and Karoline had just shown them the strings behind the performance. Daniel paced in her office, phone in hand. Your approval ratings are up, he said, still surprised. Independents, moderates, even people who don't like you are admitting you had a point. Karoline smirked. People don't like being lied to, Daniel. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. But you know this isn't over, right? They're not just going to let this go. Karoline nodded, already aware. I know, she said. That's why we don't stop now. Rachel Monroe's career took a hit, but she wasn't finished. Within days, she rebranded herself as a victim, pivoting into activism, claiming she had been targeted for telling the truth. She landed interviews, secured a book deal, and even teased a possible independent media venture. Karoline wasn't surprised. The grift was predictable. Monroe wasn't a journalist, she was an opportunist. Meanwhile, in the White House, the administration was scrambling. Karoline had thrown a grenade into the media ecosystem. Now the president's advisors were unsure how to handle her. They had planned to distance themselves, but now she was more popular than ever. One advisor suggested pushing her out quietly. Another warned it could backfire, making her a martyr. They hesitated, and that hesitation cost them control, because Karoline had a plan of her own. In the weeks that followed, Karoline didn't just defend herself, she went on offense. She gave interviews not to cable news but to podcasts, independent media, and direct-to-camera addresses. She bypassed the traditional media filters, speaking directly to the people. Her message was clear: you don't have to agree with me. You don't even have to like me. But don't let them tell you what's true, see it for yourself. And people listened. Journalists started getting called out by their own viewers. Clips of Monroe's contradictions were stitched together, exposing the game in real time. Trust in mainstream media hit another all-time low while independent voices surged. Karoline had done more than defend herself. She had sparked a movement. And as she stood in her office, watching the numbers rise, she knew this wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something far bigger. In a world where narratives are crafted, manipulated, and sold as truth, it's easy to feel powerless. Every day, we're bombarded with headlines designed to provoke, not inform. We're told what to think, what to believe, and who to trust, but rarely are we encouraged to see for ourselves. The story of Karoline Leavitt isn't just about politics or media, it's about something far bigger. It's about having the courage to stand firm when the world tries to twist your words. It's about choosing integrity over convenience, even when the cost is high. It's about knowing that truth isn't what's shouted the loudest, it's what remains standing after the noise fades. Karoline didn't fight just to clear her name, she fought because she understood what was at stake: a society that no longer questions, no longer thinks, no longer searches for what's real. And that's the battle we all face. Every time we accept a headline without question, we surrender a piece of our own judgment. Every time we let outrage dictate truth, we give up our ability to think critically. The world wants easy answers, but real truth is never easy. It demands effort, curiosity, and the willingness to push past the noise. So the next time someone tries to tell you what's real, don't just take their word for it. Look deeper. Question more. Demand the full picture. Because at the end of the day, truth isn't about politics or popularity. It's about having the courage to see through the illusion and stand for what's real, no matter what it costs.